You ever stood in front of a mirror for a lengthy amount of time? Allow self-awareness and honesty and transparency to just kind of give you a good audit. I think you'll be challenged and learned every minute of today. Welcome to Decision Points. I'm Doug Hudson.
I'm Scott Wood.
Man, welcome back, Daron Babcock. Thank you for joining us.
Excited to be back.
Our first repeat.
And you said you don't normally get asked back.
I don't normally get asked back, so
well,
this is interesting.
We like being different, so thank you for making more time for us.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
It's so great that you're back, because when we left the conversation last time, I literally had all these questions, and I was like, okay, I want to get to the next phase. I think I even asked you towards the end.
100%. You said you're coming back.
What's the vision? Where are you headed now? And you answered that question, and we'll come back to that in just a second. But I'm so glad you're back, because I want to hear the rest of the story.
Good.
Yeah.
I feel like Paul Harvey. Now you know the rest of the story.
That's right.
I guess that was probably last September, October, or when we sat down. What's been going on in your world since then?
More of the transition from Bonton Farms. As you know, we implemented the succession plan there, and Gabe Madison's the president, and she's doing an amazing job.
How long had Madison been with has she been with the organization for a little while?
We met when she was a volunteer and worked for Thomson Reuters and was helping them do community outreach work. And then she was enamored with our work, and she was so gracious to give of herself that we invited her to be on the board.
Yep.
And then she did a great job on the board, so we asked her to be board chair. And then as she got more involved, I was like, I think you have a deeper role than this. And she would just laugh at me. And then one day she came and said, I think God's really speaking to me about this. I can't ignore it. I think I am supposed to do more. And when COVID had hit, we decided to take that time, as things around the world just kind of slowed down a bit, to embark on a strategic plan in which succession, taking that seriously, was a major part of that next evolution for us. And so it just emerged that the plan came together, and then the person appeared almost simultaneously. And so as she got her legs under her running Bonton Farms, it was really important for me to step further and further away so that she could lead. And the opportunity with Stand Together Foundation came up, and they invited me to come take my experience from Bonton, travel across the country and meet other people and learn from them, and to be able to scale the work that we're doing in a way that sees relief for more vulnerable people across the country. That, unfortunately, if you look at the data, not only are we losing against all the issues we care most about, they're getting worse despite all our efforts. The social sector now is the second largest employer in the United States. Over 10% of all jobs are nonprofit, 5.7% of the GDP, and consumes over $500 billion a year. Now, in business, if you took that data and said, these are the resources we're allocating to something, you would expect an ROI that would be commensurate with that investment. Sure. And we're not getting it.
Yeah.
Probably not even expected.
I haven't met a person in this space that isn't, with every fiber of their being, trying.
Yeah. Oh, good.
But I think that, and with all the right intentions.
Yep.
So it's not like there's bad actor. I think that if you think about it, the nonprofit sector or philanthropy in the United States emerged following the Civil War. And it is the same today as it was 150 years ago.
How so?
What's changed? The way that philanthropists think about it, that the way they give, the way they support, the way that measurement's conducted, the way that we tend to focus more on symptoms of issues instead of causal factors of issues. Mm-hmm. It's really hard when you're chasing your tail to ever catch up to anything. Like, you have to get ahead of it.
So let's pause. Why did you feel that you needed to step away from Bonton, or it was time to transition to something else? Yep. What was the decision point there? Because obviously think you were making great progress and still making great progress. But
I believe the work is too important to become about a person. And the thing about work like this is that when you're doing innovative work, whether it's an entrepreneurial endeavor or whether it's in the social sector, you have to become the mouthpiece to get people to see what you see uniquely. Most entrepreneurs, everybody thinks they're crazy because they see something nobody else has yet seen.
Yep.
So that's the whole idea behind entrepreneurship,
Yeah.
right? I found a niche in this space that I can take advantage of and grow a business, or I found a niche in this space where I can help transform people's lives for the better. Whatever that is, you see something that other people don't see. And in order to be successful, you have to be a great communicator to invite people into that. And in the social sector, and maybe in the business world, we tend to make heroes or villains out of the people that have these new ideas. And for those that believe in Bonton Farms, they tend to elevate me to hero status. And it becomes something that is tied to me as a person versus the community of Bonton and what's happening there. And I just think that if Bonton lived and died with me, that would be tragic, because it's too profound of a social experiment with too significant levels of transformation to be about a person.
Yeah.
And so at some point, and from my faith background, this is not my work, this is a kingdom work.
Yeah.
And kingdom work's never about the person.
Yeah. And
so it just was a point in time where people wanted to learn about Bonton Farms and they wouldn't accept anybody else but me to come speak. Well, then, we have a team now. We're not this small little startup organization.
Not me.
There's 15 people that can come speak, and most of them live this stuff and are much better communicating their lived experience than me telling it through them. So why don't you have them on? And that's kind of an indicator that people are tending to make this about you and what your contribution to that story was, and not recognizing all of the other contributions that were levied to make that possible. And I just think that's a dangerous spot for a business. How many businesses do you have the opportunity to get a good deal on because they didn't have the foresight for a succession plan? Or
You went right where this is an incredible conversation.
Yeah. How long before you said we got to do this did this thinking begin to come in where you were like, what, I got to change this?
Well, I had told my board that from day one, that I didn't know how long I was to be here, but that we would know when the time was right, because if we're successful,
it'd be obvious.
They're going to pin this on the face of it as this is why this is working.
Yeah.
And if that story becomes the narrative, we need to either have the foresight to cut it off before it happens, or shortly after that's visible, we need to make the change.
Yeah.
So it's a hard thing to do when you birth something that you care deeply about, to let go of that.
Yeah.
Walk us through some of your
than
emotions, Darren, and maybe decision points or inflection points when you all noticed this. Was this then a 3-year process? Walk us through that transition, because I think we're speaking to the crux of many organizations getting past 10, 12, 15, $20 million in revenue to 100. It cannot be tied to one person. Walk us through that process.
Well, I think the best organizations that I've ever experienced, and I learned from this throughout my career, everybody in the organization should have a succession plan.
Yeah.
And if you're not thinking that way, then that's when companies have key contributors that, for whatever reason, get ill or have an opportunity elsewhere, or life circumstances change, and then you have this void that somebody's not prepared to fill, and there's a setback. And the way you circumvent that is that you're always building up a team for somebody who's next if you don't show up tomorrow. In the social sector space where people's lives hang in the balance of this, I think it's even more weighty than when it's about a balance sheet and a P&L statement. But I just think being aware that when you create something, the same ideas that birthed it are not the same ideas that are going to sustain it. And to be able to have the foresight to see that we need a new interjection of leadership and new innovation with vision, and the space for somebody new to come in and to apply that without the encumbrance to say, well, my inclination is to say, well, we tried that before and it didn't work. Well, just because you tried it before one way doesn't mean it wouldn't be the right thing to do another way and another time, and maybe with a different approach.
Right.
And so I have all these paradigms that are fixed based on my experience, and I'm inhabiting now the potential of the organization because I birthed it and I know what worked and didn't work at that time, but now I've become constrained by those things and now stagnate the ability for it to live into its potential. And then, just as I said earlier, in the social sector specifically, we tend to make, if your work is substantial enough to garner attention, people either villainize you because there's a portion of our society that just likes to hate success,
Yep.
or they make you a hero. And I think that's dangerous. We can handle the villainization part, but the making of the hero is dangerous. It's not ever true.
Yeah.
And secondly, it's an elixir. It's hard to, it's, as Nick Saban always says, don't believe the rat poison.
Yeah.
All of those positive stories about you are just rat poison. And so I just think being self-aware, and for me, the best analogy I can give to the process is it's like when your children leave home for me. When my children left home, my oldest son went into the Marine Corps and went straight to Afghanistan. So not only am I losing the relationship as I always knew it, and it would never be the same, but I'm also sending my son to war. And then followed the next year with my younger son going to college. And then all of a sudden, I was a single father 14 years. Now all of a sudden, two things I invested my life in are my work and my family dynamic change. And how do you reorientate your life with that major loss of purpose? And it's a process that I think is exciting and invigorating as much as it is scary. And, I think there's times where you just go through depression at the loss of something that meant something so much to you. And you no longer have that same kind of input, control, leadership, the ability to navigate it. And for me, as I shared with you last time, when my life fell apart and the things I'd been chasing my whole life, money and status and all that, became shallow. And what God revealed to me was relationships are really the thing that nobody can take away.
Yeah. That's right.
And so that's most important. And every time you have this, whether it be a company and the succession plan from that, or whether it be your children leaving home, there's a relational loss. They just won't be the same. And that's, I think, the most traumatic for me.
Having another interview with somebody, we were talking about sometimes the power, which obviously can, that word alone, it says elixir to your point. But when you would call as the CEO or founder of Bonton, when people were going to take your call, and all of a sudden, is it Maddie? Is it
Gabe?
Gabe.
Yeah.
When Gabe takes over, Gabe now stewards that power. You're at the house wondering, nobody's calling.
No, I don't think call me anymore.
So when you started down the path and you recognize, okay, it's time.
Yeah.
It's time to make a change. I think I know the answer to this, but I want to ask the question. Because you've done this a few times in your arc of your life. I mean, how did you approach that decision in terms of, okay, Lord, what do you have? What's next for me?
I have learned the only way for me to live authentically into my faith as best as I can, and I'm not great at it still, and to be the kind of person I want to be, I have to hold on loosely to things. Like I don't own things, and life may change on a dime. People you love dearly could become deathly ill or die tomorrow. Yeah. Your health could disappear tomorrow. And like how we hold on loosely to those things we don't control becomes just a great asset to have in life as you mature and learn through these lessons. And so I try to practice holding on loosely to everything except my faith.
Yeah.
Because that's the only thing I control is my faith and what God's doing in my life. Apart from that, I surrender.
Did you have the answer for the next step before you release the reins, or did you release the reins and then you're like, okay, what do you have for me?
It's in my faith journey experience, it's almost always the latter.
Yeah.
Everything I've experienced that's good in life from the point of time I came into faith has been a series of this same model revealing itself. Nothing good happens until you step out of the boat.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's an act of faith. And then when you take that step of faith, you don't know what's coming next, but the journey will reveal itself down the road. And if you don't take that first step out of the boat, you don't know what all the opportunities could have been or might have been.
Yeah.
And it's a part of living a surrendered life, I think, is we especially in this country try to control too much of our lives, and in doing so miss out on the greatest
100%.
blessings I think the world has to offer.
I think we're done here.
Yeah.
I think this is a wrap.
Yeah.
That's really well said.
No, it's incredible,
Yeah.
Darren. And it's so funny. I love this analogy of stepping out of the boat. Just this week in a couple of the interviews, really wealthy, successful people have sat here. They were in this big boat that was secure. Secure is an illusion as well, right? Those companies could have easily just gone down the tank too, but they wanted and they felt compelled to go start something. And even with their experience and probably a decent bank account, they all said stepping from the security to this dinghy, and again, the dinghy was already probably going to be successful, but just to take that step, they all said the word terrifying.
Yeah.
But that's
faith.
where it makes it less about us and more about our faith.
It's terrifying and it isn't, right? Like if you have a strong faith, I mean, you don't know the answer, but in a sense, there's peace.
That's well
right?
said.
Like there's peace.
Yeah.
It's a tug of war.
Yeah.
I mean, that's this whole conversation is that it's both and.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And navigating through which one to give space to at the right time,
Yep.
I think is the science of it.
That's right. And so there's wisdom and then there's faith. And not always, are you foolish or are you faithful? I'm not sure.
Both.
So when we got to the end of the last podcast, I asked, okay, well, because I could hear you going there already. And I was like, okay, what's the big vision? And it was really more about Bonton in the prior podcast. But so just refresh our listeners' memory on kind of the answer to that question. I remember what your answer was, but I want you to answer it. And then we'll spend some time there.
As true to the story, we implemented the succession plan. Gabe became president. I was planning to work alongside her for about a year, but she didn't really need me. And one of the things that revealed itself is my presence was encumbering her ability to establish herself as a leader, because by default, people kept deferring to me whenever there was hey, we hadn't done this before.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's okay. But you said, and so I needed to leave earlier. So that got expedited. And the lack of faith the fear of the uncertainty, and all of a sudden my mind goes, am I going to be as happy and joyful going out and working, make for $1 again, as I was engaged in the survival of people that are fighting for their lives every day? That feels like a hard bridge to go back over.
Sure.
And all this was going through my mind, and I had a call today with the executive director of Stand Together Foundation, who I'd been friends with for 8 years and had been trying to convince him.
Had Stand Together been funding Bonton?
Not really.
Not really.
Just had, they are a funder, but they're mostly about how to elevate the social sector, to do more of to do better what they're already doing.
Tell the audience about Stand Together.
It was founded, I don't know how long ago, originally a seminar network where a group of folks that were kind of in the sphere of Charles Koch and would meet and talk about politics and business and global trends and global markets and philanthropy and all of that evolved into a foundation called Stand Together Foundation about 9 years ago.
Okay.
And it was just an effort to take the next step to say that for those that have been blessed with so much, how do we get really smart and intentional about how we give back to see the change we want to see in the world, not just to give, but to actually hold accountable to see the needle move in a direction where we start winning against some of the issues we care most about. And the social sector's just not been, there's amazing people doing great work, but if you were just to do an investment analysis, like just business without all the feelings, we're not winning.
Yeah.
And it's going to require some humility and some innovation to enter the space. Because if you look at where we are as a country, society's devolving at a rate that's unprecedented in this country. And I could give you 1,000 data points to prove that.
But what does devolving mean? Give us one or two tangibles.
For the first time in the history of our country, deaths of despair, both overdose deaths and suicide deaths, are outpacing death by vehicle, each independently, for the first time in the history.
Wow.
We have almost 7 million working age, able-bodied men that have opted out of the workforce for the first time in American history. For the first time since the Spanish flu, life expectancy for Americans has dropped 3 years in a row. Like, we have too many firsts that are not positive.
Not positive.
We have 50-year highs for increase in poverty, people experiencing poverty. Like, all of the things that you would say, whether it be addiction or human trafficking or homelessness, all of those poverty, low educational outcomes, lack of engagement with workforce, all of those issues that you may have a propensity to have a passion about are growing exponentially. Not one of them can we say we're really winning in this space. And then if you look at the indicators, like in the United States, we're 7.3 million affordable housing units short from demand today. On top of that, now compare where's the puck's going. Wages over the last 20 years have gone up 91%. What have housing costs gone up over the same period?
Probably twice that.
254%.
Yeah.
So what is that telling you? If more people are experiencing poverty
behind
and becoming housing unstable,
We're drowning.
and if you look at where the data is going, and if you don't like homelessness today, what do you see on the horizon 5 years from now? What we've been doing is not going to get us where we need to go to survive. And we're at, in my opinion, a tipping point where we're on the precipice of cratering if some of these things don't start turning the corner.
So I know a little bit about Stand Together, and what little bit I know is organization of really passionate people that come together, that stand together to try to solve some of these problems. And the spirit of the standing together or coming together is really that the government's not going to solve these problems. Like we're going to have to figure out a better solution. And then the other piece that I was also impressed by was the fact that, to your point, there's a lot of people doing great work around the country, around the world, but it tends to be isolated and not at scale.
Yeah.
And it feels like to me, again, from just what little bit I know, that Stand Together is really about looking at someone who's having success at a maybe local level or micro level, and then trying to figure out, okay, that works really well. Is there a macro solution that can be applied to help solve whatever the issue is, homelessness or food deserts or whatever it is?
Some of them are components. Some of them would be, if you just think about how we measure an issue. If you think about people experiencing homelessness, well, you might measure it typically by how many people do you shelter.
Yeah.
Is that the right metric to know if we can solve the problem or not?
Right.
If you went and ate at our restaurant in Bonton and I gave you my review of how your experience was, how do you think I would score it in contrast to how you might score it?
Mm-hmm.
In the social sector, we don't have the voice of customer.
Right.
So isn't that odd that the voiceless, once again, don't have a voice in the very trajectory of are their lives getting better by this work?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's an area that you think, well, gosh, what nonprofit has the capacity to build a data science team and to rethink about how we do measurement in the social sector?
Yeah.
Probably none.
Yeah.
But Stand Together could do that and then share it across the entire social sector so it elevates everybody so that we now have the voice of the most vulnerable telling us how our work is either affecting them in a positive way or not.
Yeah.
Because that will inform us what we need to do better in the future.
All right. So take us back to where you got connected with Stand Together.
So they called just providentially. They called at this point in time where I was going to have to make a really difficult decision and said, all that stuff you've been talking to us about for the last 8 years, we recognize, we want to endeavor. So we don't know what to do.
They had not been funding Bonton, but you built a relationship with them, or maybe you were going to the conferences and speaking about some of the things that you guys were doing. Okay.
Yep. Their primary contribution is elevating our ability to do the work we're already doing better.
Yeah.
And so we were part of them to glean as much as we could for how do we get better at what we're so passionate about. And if funding came along, that would be a bonus.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the main crux of the relationship. And they just said, we see this, but we don't know how to do it. And we'd love for you to come build it for us. Would you come build it? Which is like, I couldn't have written a better job description to take what I love, what I've immersed myself in for over a decade, and then to be able to come and be a part of an organization that's resourced in a way that I can grow my learning and get better at what I do. So not only can I come back and help Bonton, but I can help people all over the country. So I can't wait to wake up every morning and get my boots on and get out the door. I
Got your boots on.
Yeah, I got my
So
boots
when you
on.
wake up every day right now, what are you working on?
Well, I'm working coast to coast. So normally my calls start on the East Coast early at about 7 because it's 8 o'clock there. And we're working with organizations like LeBron James Family Foundation and the Washington Nationals Academy and Downtown Boxing Gym in Detroit that are all doing really profound work. But like the rest of us, want to do better. And so I get to work with them to understand what they're doing that's working well and what the areas that they need improvement on and how can we come alongside to help them do that.
And is this is not, you're not working on replicating Bonton and other, because when we talked before, you gave us the statistic, and you maybe even said it this morning, of the number of communities around the country that look very similar to Bonton. What's that number again?
825 neighborhoods like Bonton that are home to about 40 million Americans.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so your work at Stand Together is not necessarily on those 800 plus communities, is it, or is it?
Well, it is, but the thing that's really important is that there is no model that will work everywhere.
Yeah.
And so what we want to do is help share ideas and principles.
Yeah.
And, I'll give you an example. I would argue that in the social sector, we spend too much of our time on symptoms of problems and alleviating those symptoms instead of removing those barriers. And so an idea would be like, let's hold ourselves to a higher standard, not to just alleviate the symptom, but to look for an entrepreneurial, innovative solution that removes that barrier for all of us. And so that's just a point of view. That's a way of thinking. And if I shift my way of thinking away from saying I can accept a Band-Aid on a terminal wound, or I'm not going to accept a Band-Aid, I'm going to heal this terminal wound. Well, that point of view makes all the difference in the world. So it sounds silly, but it actually is the key that unlocks the door for innovation to happen, that actually starts breaking down these barriers once and for all.
It's like, okay, I need to let the baby cry this out so he or she learns to sleep through the night. But that literally means, again, and I'm the novice here, you're the expert, not focused on some immediate symptoms means food, housing, transportation, safety, all these things. So I think we're getting to that crux of the vision and the effort that you all, how do you fight this together? These 825 communities, how is Stand Together? How are you? What are some of these principles, Darren? Because one of the beauties about content, a lot of the folks listening to Decision Points live in the Texas Southwest region, but content goes global.
Yep.
Someone's in Seattle or Philly or Chicago right now. How do you serve both and? You can't just stop serving the symptoms, can you?
Thank you for asking that question, because that's a really important point, is that I would argue, and this is not data, this is just an opinion, I think about 90 to 95% of the social sector are akin to ambulance drivers at the bottom of a cliff waiting for people that have fallen off and broken all their bones to rush them to triage to see if they can put back together again. And that's important, and we need it. So don't hear me wrong.
Yeah.
We're not trying to outcompete or put ambulance drivers out of business. But what we need is a smaller group of entrepreneurial mavericks that want to see real transformation happen and want to shift their philanthropy to being foundation and fence builders. Because if we don't stop the flow of people falling off the cliff, we cannot keep up with it.
We cannot get enough ambulance rescue people.
You can't.
It won't happen.
And the truth is, the batting average once they've fallen off the cliff of remediating all of that trauma and damage is really low versus if you can remediate it before the fall happens.
Yeah,
it's much better. And so it's a gradual shift of a portion. Again, ambulance drivers are beautiful and we need them, and man, people are in crisis and need that every day. And so please do more of that and do it better. But if we don't carve out a way to innovate ways to keep people from falling off the cliff in the first place, we will drown under the weight of these problems.
This cannot be either or. This has to be both and.
If I'm overly successful and shift too many people to building foundations and fences, I will do as much damage as it is currently where all we are is ambulance drivers. It has to be a balance in the right way.
Right before we started the podcast, I think Scott and I asked you essentially, and Scott alluded to it, but I want you to break it down some more, because in the business mind, we get franchise, right? This concept works here. and everybody's hungry. Let's just replicate it.
Well, yeah. So at the end of the last podcast, again, hate to keep going back there, but just to tie it together, and you said it's 825, 825 communities around the country that have similar characteristics to Bonton, and so my head immediately went to, okay, we've got a proven model here in Dallas, Texas. Let's just go replicate that one community at a time, times 825 communities, and we can spend the rest of our life on that. And we're gonna change.
Yeah, it's done.
We're gonna change the world.
825
right?
operators, franchisees.
Yeah.
Boom.
So why does that not work?
Yeah,
because that's where I wanted to go when we finished.
You can't do 2 and 4 people. You'll run the best ideas, and you'll do more damage to the people you care about.
Yeah.
If you sweep in and say, "I'm the hero and I have the answers for you."
Yeah.
What works well in families and in business is when you share the idea, and it's owned by the community.
Yeah.
And if I come in and prescribe it like a franchisor would. If I come in and prescribe it, you have no ownership in your own problem solving. And because I own it and am doing it to you, that lack of equity in that relationship will eventually lead to severe trauma and brokenness and a lack of the outcomes that you did it in the first place for. If you can just show a little patience and invite the communities that you work with to have co-ownership in it and to build it with you, even if you already understand the framework of what it is we're going to build, I'm just not going to be so audacious to come in and give you the answer in the model. We're going to have to do this work together. That's right. That nuance makes all the difference in the world.
Well, and that's where when you first started going to Bonton, you spent, I can't remember the exact timeline, but a couple of years building relationships with that community before there was ever really a Bonton farm.
And I did that out of ignorance.
Yeah.
I would have
Well, you were going there, and then you were getting something, to move there, right?
And you were getting something back. It was feeding your soul, and it was healing you in some ways.
Absolutely.
Which, created this really beautiful reciprocal relationship with that community.
Yeah.
But that's, you're learning there. Obviously you can translate that now.
Yeah, I'm a fixer and a problem solver. So if I thought I knew what I was doing, I would have gone into Bonton and screwed it up.
You would have had the 7 things, and we're going to run this play.
Yeah. And I had the blessing of ignorance, which paralyzed my natural proclivity to jump in and take command. And I had to slow down and listen. And that was the best blessing that I could have ever had, because Bonton would not exist today, and Bonton Farms would not exist today. We'd have been booted out, and I might not be sitting here.
Yeah.
Well, they tried to boot you out, and they were testing to see if you were going to just leave.
Roll up and go home,
Do you still live in the community?
No, we moved out about 2 years ago.
Yeah.
My youngest son got married, and we have a little granddaughter, and we want to have space and a place where they can come leave her with us.
Yeah, it's awesome.
So it's part of the
transition to releasing that as well.
We moved 7. We're careful. Like, it's really important if you're going to commit to work like that. Our communities have this fear of abandonment because it just happens all the time.
That's the muscle that they're most common. Well, one of
So it's almost like we're always waiting for the shoe to drop. And so it's important because it's real to me, and Bonton is my family. Like, as close as my blood family, they are to me. But like my children, there's different stages of that relationship. And so we were able to move like 7 minutes away.
Incredible.
Live in Buckner Terrace, which is just a little bit north east of Bonton. And so we're close enough that we can be there in a heartbeat, but we're not there every day where we're impeding the progress of what's this new part of the journey.
I was just going to say now, okay, go back to Stand Together and the work that you're trying to do there. So what are some of the principles from the Bonton Farms experience that you're now trying to help these other nonprofits, these other agencies, and these other communities to learn?
I'll tell you maybe one that sounds silly but isn't. It's really profound to start with, maybe because it's the most probably provocative of them, is that we have this primary principle of we believe in people.
Yeah.
Which sounds silly.
Didn't the Kochs write a book on that?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Charles and Brian Hooks wrote a book called Believe in People.
Yep.
But the reason it's so profound is there's this quote I love that says, if you show me the outcome, the journey will reveal itself. And I've never met a person that says, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Who doesn't believe in people?
Yeah.
But you don't have to tell me that because it's evidenced by the outcome.
100%.
If you don't truly believe in people, you spend your time trying to fix them or serve them. If you love your children, you don't always fix and serve them. You empower them to take care of themselves and to learn hard lessons and to hold them accountable along the way. And there's a radical difference in that. And I would go back to that foundation and fence versus ambulance driver thing. We need both.
Yeah.
But we do a lot more of the former and not enough of the latter, where we're actually having people equipped with all that they need. And now you have personal responsibility to navigate this journey, but you're not alone.
Correct.
We'll do it with you. And not only are we going to help you, but we're also going to tell you the hard truths when you're not doing your part, because that's what a true relationship is. And so believing in people is one. The idea that Charles says this is an amazing video. I would love for your team to go look up, but it's Charles talking about, I bet if you Google Charles Koch, hockey stick of human progress, it'll come up.
We'll find this and we'll put a link to it on
It's
the podcast.
really profound, but it's basically traces humanity from the entry point to this day and how every innovation that allows for greater freedom is followed by greater prosperity. And so he says we are here to remove barriers because free people are capable of extraordinary things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's another mental model or point of view, this principled idea that if we can remove barriers for people, think of the Bonton Farms Act, the law that we were able to change the criminal justice system because men and women coming home from state and federal prison come home to cities and counties where they have fines and ordinances that have compounded because I haven't been able to show up to court because I've been in prison.
Right.
And now I come home from prison. Who does it serve that they come home to 13 warrants for their arrest and $15,000 of fines because I couldn't go to court while I was in prison? That's a barrier.
Right.
That holds people back. In the United States, 54% of all men and women will recidivate in the first 12 months. That's a failure of a system. When you have more people failing than succeeding, that's a systemic failure. And so why is that? Well, there's reasons. And if we can start knocking them down, removing those barriers one at a time, then we can start seeing more people enter society successfully. And who doesn't win when that happens?
Right.
And so it sounds silly, some of these ideas, but if you govern your decision making and your work around these principles, you will not settle for less than. You will not settle for, well, we'll just create another program that when they come out, we're going to pacify them and help them with their needs so they can eventually get through the legal system. So we'll have some court-appointed lawyers that help them navigate this process. Well, that's a Band-Aid and it's good,
right.
But is that good enough or is it better if we fight the legislation to pass a law that removes the barrier?
Yeah.
And if you hold to that principle, you're always challenging to move from Band-Aid to solution, from Band-Aid to solution. So those are some examples, and I could go on.
We probably want you to. A principle I want you to keep kind of fighting and leaning into, Darren, is I heard you say a couple of things that sound super simple, but again, as we are trying to to educate Scott and myself, as well as anyone else listening, believe in people.
Yep.
But then
And mean it.
Correct.
Test
correct.
it.
And
Litmus test it
because
to
what
see if
you
it's
said
true.
to follow up was, I think it was Charles or one of them said, free people
Free people are capable of extraordinary things.
they are free. They live in America.
There's a lot of encumbrances and barriers here. We have more regulation. If you think about a young lady trying to come out and maybe she's had a breakdown of the family and I've got to earn and try to be a mother and head of my household, and I'm going to try to go through beauty school. You know, the fees and licenses and regulations just to try to become a beautician or to be able to cut somebody's hair. Almost everything now is regulated and has this licensing fee structure that create barriers for people to enter work, that stifle entrepreneurialism, that doesn't help anybody. It's just another fee structure that the American public gets very little about, but it's stifling small business and families that these little small businesses maybe run out of their home or whatever, are their lifeline to contributing back to society. And if they're precluded from doing that, What are my alternatives if you don't allow me to work legally? Is I'm going to wind up taking a side hustle that is street business. And then I'm subjecting myself to losing my freedom or my life in the process.
It's really well said. And I think as we continue to talk about the scale of this, because I think this is one of the things that caught both Scott and I, there are these 825 communities that you would say, if you take those zip codes versus a bunch of other zip codes, walk with through this analogy, and then start to say how we break this, which I know we're doing. I think you would say in those 825 communities, the bulk of all those people born in that zip code or community are born, in a sense, with one shackle on them already, one encumbrance, 5 encumbrances, 10, versus someone is born with 0 or less.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
How do we fight? I'm listening to Darren right now. How do I start to get educated and get involved?
Well, I think that the number one thing that needs to happen that's easiest to do is that we are in this place because we don't know each other. We're divided, and we need to come together. Brian Stevenson wrote a book called Just Mercy, and it talks about the importance of proximity to solving these problems. If you don't understand, if you're in business and you don't understand your customer, it's highly likely that you're going to develop a product or service that doesn't meet their needs, and you're going to struggle as a result. And it's not dissimilar when you try to address a social problem. You have to be close enough to the problem that you deeply understand it so that you can then become part of it. Our social fabric in the country, we talk at each other based on what the news tells us about each other. And it's not flattering any way you slice it. It's also not true. That's the good news, right? I mean, the things that get amplified are the fringes.
Yeah, well said.
They're not the norm. And so while there's fringe examples of that truth, that is not the way it is, generally speaking. And so how do we overcome that? We have to come in proximity. I think we all know in this country that economics is the foundation for everything else to happen. So Bonton and the 824 of its sister communities are the way they are because they were isolated post-slavery during segregation for poor and predominantly at the time African Americans that are no longer slaves to call those places home because we didn't want them living in our communities.
And that's a hard reality.
It's just history, though.
Correct, but we have to face that. You've got to start with truth.
I got to understand.
These were designed essentially to be racially discriminated, non-successful communities.
Yes.
You would agree with that?
It's
fact.
It's factual and provable without hesitation. If you think of if you're familiar with the story of Black Wall Street, so that we think of that as an anomaly, but that wasn't an anomaly. That happened all over because blacks starting out in these isolated communities, if I couldn't shop at your restaurant or eat at your restaurant, shop at your store, go to your hospital, participate in your bank, we had to collaborate to create our own businesses. And prosperity started happening through this collaboration and entrepreneurship in these freedmen's communities, these isolated African-American startup neighborhoods. And that was met with resistance. We didn't want that prosperity either. If you read the book, The Accommodation, I believe in there's a quote from our former mayor, Wallace Savage, at this point in time in history, I believe it was the late 40s, where this prosperity started happening in Bonton, and before it was Bonton, it was referenced as Bombtown, because as our community built businesses and started to prosper and buy land and housing where there was plumbing and running water and electricity, because if I can afford it, who doesn't want that? Well, the people didn't want them moving in and near their neighborhood, so they bombed them, hence the name Bombtown. So our response to it happened all across the country too. This wasn't an anomaly to Dallas. Well, federal government came out with public housing program. So Dallas, Mayor Wallace Savage says in the Times-Herald, in order to prevent the blacks from moving closer to us and bringing with them disease and violence, we're going to apply for this new federal program to build public housing to keep them where they belong. There's a quote from our mayor in the newspaper.
What year was that?
Late 40s or maybe 50, 51.
And what was the book that was right?
The Accommodation. A great book that's finally been republished and is available, and it tells a really gory, ugly history of our city. But my grandfather used
factual
and true, and it's all it's all sourced and all that. But my grandfather used to say the past is best used as a guiding post, not a hitching post.
Yeah.
So we aren't rehashing these stories to try to feel bad about ourselves and to go back to that point in time and say we're all broken and this isn't going to work. It is to say this was our starting point. Now, how do we acknowledge it, heal, and grow past it?
Right.
Yep.
We are not victims. We are overcomers.
Right.
And so, but I don't know I don't know what I'm overcoming if I don't acknowledge what there is that I'm overcoming.
Yeah. Well said. I want to
Let me finish with that real quick. So the public housing, what happened is in already depressed places with no resources, now you congregate in density, more people with no resources. And guess what? At the turn of the century, African Americans had the highest intact family rate of any ethnic group in the United States, over 80%. All of a sudden, public housing comes out. And guess what the key to getting a voucher was? Couldn't be married. So all of a sudden, well, if I'm poor and need housing and the government's offering me housing, but the man can't be in the home, go find someplace to stay. What happens when a man's not in the home? We're not very good adults.
It's a broken family. It's not intact.
Not intact. And then we don't act very good.
We structurally helped crush an intact 80% family.
Now I think it's a little over 20%, the intact family rate in the African-American community. And that's a systemic thing. So again, great news. Because if it's systemic, we can build a different system.
Well said.
Yeah.
Like this is not bad news. This is stuff that we can solve because we created it.
Yeah. Yeah. These were man-made
Yes.
restraints, shackles, lack of freedom in a free country.
And then you say, well, what's the result of that? Well, in Bonton, they come in and build a highway and a river. So now we're isolated by a highway and a river and a railroad. And this is not uncommon. That's why most inner city communities were referred to decades ago as what's on the other side of the tracks.
Yeah.
Because it was designed that way. Well, that creates this isolation that stifles economic opportunity. That and the fact that any business, before you build a business in a location, what do? You run a demographic report to say, does this have the demographics, the income, the traffic? Does this have the ingredients for me to have a successful business? Well, none of those ingredients are there when 50% of the people live below the poverty line. Mm-hmm. Disposable income's not there for any good and service that you might have. So what doesn't come? Economics.
Correct.
If economics don't come, then guess what? You won't have a grocery store. You won't have a bank. You won't have a hospital. You won't have any of the other institutions that we all use to build a life with. And so while, yes, we live in the freest country in the history of the world, there are monumental barriers that we would say encumber true freedom, that limit people's potential that God created in all of us. Amen. And that we are better as a society when we work together to break down those barriers so more people live into the fullness of who God says they are.
Because we believe in people.
Because we believe in people.
I'm listening. I'm watching. Man, this is making so much sense. The hardest thing is that first step. Coach us up on how someone takes that first step. I'm
not trying to dodge your question, but I think there is a really good answer to that. It's just probably not what you're looking for.
I don't.
But the answer is that do what you love and what God's given you the talent and resources to do, and don't do more than that. He gave you that for a reason. And so what nonprofits, again, tend to do more often than not is people come down and say, how can I help? And I tell you, well, I need money. Everybody needs money. But if you don't have money, if that's not the one asset you tend to have, then I've just lost somebody that deeply cared about our work and wanted to contribute in some way. But maybe you're great at loving on people. Maybe you're great at building relationships. Maybe you have a law degree and can help people through some of their legal issues. Maybe you're a gifted. You know how many men come to Bonton and I tell them that I need their gift at making money to help me figure out ways to make money in places that haven't had those catalysts or economic engines before. And they look at me like I'm speaking Mandarin. And they, like for so long I've gone to church and I almost feel guilty that my gift is making money.
Yeah.
And I've been told that my way to give back is to work parking lot attendant or to work in the nursery. And now you're telling me I can use this gift for making money to help? Absolutely.
Yep.
Use what God gave you to use and don't try to do something else, because what will happen is we're all busy. And if it's not reciprocal, if it's not mutually beneficial, when life gets busy or hectic or chaotic, you're going to go back to, this isn't giving me life, so I'm going to revert back. And now we've lost somebody with a gift to contribute, solve a problem that you are uniquely positioned to give to.
If you're giving out of your giftedness, like it's not work.
Correct.
And if
it's not work, and it feeds your soul. and you want to do more.
You want to
of
do
it.
more of it.
Even when you're busy, even when your schedule's tight, even when you're stressed, you're like, this feeds my soul, and I want to give more.
Yep.
But that's where I think,
That's what we
Darren,
need.
it speaks to, because if you're doing 2 or 4, that's not a mutual relationship.
It's not mutually beneficial when you're either egotistical enough that you want the credit.
Yep.
So again, when you do this work, we all need to just step back and say the first criteria is to become really self-aware. Because if you're doing this, if your motives aren't pure, you're going to hurt people, and nobody wants to hurt people. So
Correct.
Just be self-reflective and say, "Am I actually doing this to serve?" I think it might have been Richard Ellis. We were talking about the Ellis brothers earlier. Would say that you know how to know whether somebody has a servant's heart or not. How they respond when you treat them as a servant. There's just questions you can ask yourself. When I started volunteering at Bonton, my self-reflection was, why is going down there for 2 hours on a Saturday the highlight of my week? Because it made me feel better about me.
Mm-hmm.
But was it mutually beneficial? Was my 2 hours on a Saturday changing people's lives in Bonton? No, it wasn't. I had to do. So
How'd you work through that? How'd you work?
For me, I had to recognize that I was doing this selfishly and doing it under the guise of I'm helping those folks down in Bonton that need my help. And it wasn't true, and it wasn't life-giving, and it wasn't making a difference. And so
it was for you at the moment.
But it's not helping me either. If I'm feeling my ego without doing it's a lie that I'm buying into. It's like self-medicating. It's an addiction. It's not healthy for me either. So it's not healthy for anybody. It may give you some false sense of satisfaction, but it is not the real thing. It's an imposter. And so being self-aware when you step into this work, I think, is really important, and asking yourself really tough questions. But if you're not trying to do it for your own glory, why wouldn't you give the power and the glory to the people that are closest to the problem, that actually have the lived experience, that actually, another one of our principles is what we call bottom up, which just basically means that the people closest to the problem are usually best positioned to come up with a resolution to the problem. And so, as a parent, the more that I did for my children, the more I did to them and for them, the more I crippled them from developing into the men I wanted them to be. If you want your child to have patience, what do? You solve all their problems.
You give them everything they want when they first scream.
So you don't do for and to them, right? You give them space to experience things where they have to learn the skill of patience. And it's the same way in this work, is that you do things with people and alongside people, but not to them and for them.
I keep feeling, though, like I'm sitting here, and again, I think part of this is just personal in the sense that we've been in this city for a long time. We've been in ministries or churches, and you've heard countless appeals to go serve or help. But yet, everything you've said today, we're not making progress. In fact, we're losing worse than we were 10 years ago. Yeah. So I'm listening in my probably decent car or decent home and comfortable, and I'm just not sure what to take from Darren's message today. If you had 100 people or 1,000, which I know you have had, continue to speak into us, what we like steps, and I may not like the steps you give me. What are our step 1, 2, or 3?
Step 1 is to bloom where you're planted.
Love it.
I mean, your home.
What's that mean?
Well, your home reflective of what you want it to be, and if not, should you serve more there? Is your block? Do you know the people on your block, and are you ministering and serving and supporting the people closest to you, where you live and call home every day? You spend 8-12 hours a day at work.
I'm mad at half of them because they didn't mow their grass or they do their fat. Yeah.
Do you know your teammates here at work? Do you know what their life is like? Are you taking the time to do more than just transact business with them, but you spend a third of your life here? Are you investing in the culture and in your people so that you're helping their lives be better, just not providing a means to provide for their family? Bloom where you're planted. And then God calls us, some of us, to certain places that require more, but I don't think that's normal. I think it would be a huge mistake for people walking away from here saying, I need to go find one of those 825 communities. Like maybe if you feel that, and if you feel called to that, that's something you have to work through with your creator. But for most of us, our world is falling apart around us, and it's in the places where we're planted and we're just not engaged. We have a record in our country, over 100,000 people a year dying of fentanyl overdoses. We are mentally more ill and more cases of depression, and we are one of the unhappiest countries in the world. If prosperity is
There's an article in
equatable to
the
happiness.
Wall Street Journal this week about that.
Yeah, I just read that. So what can we do locally? Bloom where you're planted. What can I do in my family, in my neighborhood, in my work, where I'm already present? And that's the low-hanging bar, really. It's the low-hanging fruit of where I can plug in most effectively.
And God will call you to wherever you're supposed to serve.
Sometimes just being willing to do that is akin to taking a step out the boat.
Yeah.
That we started about.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do, but I'm going to take that step out of the boat, and I'm going to look at my family, and I'm going to do an analysis and say, is my family healthy in the way that I want it to be? And if not, what does it require from me to invest in it to get it there? And then do I know my neighbors? Like, let's take if you go from home and then work your way out, where do you spend the most of your time, and where those relationships matter? Are you part of a church? Are you attending your small group? How are you civically engaged? We're at an all-time low for civic engagement.
I've been privileged to serve an organization in Dallas this year as the president of the organization, and it was not something that I was aware was going to happen. It just happened, and I found myself in this seat, and it's been the hardest year. I'm 6 months, actually about 9 months in, but it's been the hardest year because it's demanding. There's a lot going on, but it's been the most fulfilling year. And I'm just every day filled with incredible gratitude, not only for what the organization does, but the membership of this organization and how they feed me. Like I'm the greatest beneficiary of being able to sit in the seat because of what the organization is giving back to me through getting to serve. And I didn't, just to your point, like I didn't go manufacture that to happen. It just happened. And then I was like, oh wow, okay, all right, I guess this is where I'm supposed to go next. And it's pretty neat when it happens that way.
But you blossomed where you planted. You were in this organization, and you were serving, you were being faithful, and then opportunity came to serve at a deeper level. And I think about what you put in, as simple that is, what you put into something is what you get out of it. And I think you would agree with that. You, as you serve, and as you just invest of yourself, then the two-way street really begins to unfold.
Yeah, I would say that equation is even richer on the backside. It's not that you get out what you put in; you get out multiples than you put in, and I don't know that's true anywhere else.
Yeah.
But when you serve other people, especially vulnerable, I think you get paid. In my experience, which is all I have, the dividends are much richer than the investment.
Incredible.
It's not a standard formula. It comes back in multiples.
One of our favorite exercises here, I can't remember if we did it last time with you, Darren, or maybe it popped up after because you were early in the process. If you had 100 business owners and CEOs in front of us, and what would you close them with? What would be your final word to them?
Gosh, I think that if we just take a step back and look from 100,000 foot point of view, there's three mechanisms we can use to change our world for the better: government, social sector, and faith communities. Like, those are the three institutions that are poised to serve in the world that we live in. So those are our vehicles. Like, how do we maximize the use of those vehicles? I would argue that the most effective way for those three arms to be productive is for the business community to lead, because business understands how to make things work, how to solve problems, how to monetize things, how to create sustainable endeavors. And I don't think that we'll begin winning against these issues unless we do a better job of activating the business community, Can I regress just a minute
say
until I
anything
may
you
have
want.
told this story on the last podcast. but
Tell it.
7-8 years ago, I got invited to do a podcast. This is where the business ownership thing comes into
Yeah.
me. It was a TED Talk. And I told them no because they wanted me to tell the story of Bonton. And I wanted Bonton to tell their story. And my community kept saying, nobody's ever asked us our story before. Nobody wants to know our story. Go tell it. One day it'll be us. So I had never prepared for anything like this before. With every fiber of my being, I wanted to represent my community well, but I didn't slow down to think about the purpose of a TED Talk. That's the ability to share ideas that have the power to change the world. And so when I get there, they wanted me to talk about food deserts because Bonton Farms, and that's the sexy thing. It's a lot sexier than the people struggling in the gangs and the addiction stuff and all that. So I went with what they gave me, and I tried to squeeze in a larger story. But the guy that spoke before me was talking about autonomous vehicles, and that when those are available on our streets, they'll make over 1 billion calculations a second at 70 miles an hour to be statistically safer than with you or I behind the wheel. The lady that spoke after me was a geneticist from the Mayo Clinic talking about something that was dear to me because a lot of my friends in Bonton have late-stage renal failure from either undiagnosed high blood pressure or diabetes. And absent a kidney transplant, they're going to die. Mm-hmm. And so she's talking about organ transplantation and the whole process of, God forbid, you get in an accident and you've checked that box on your license, and the challenge of care flighting your organ to the person that needs it while the integrity of it's intact, to the danger of the surgery, to the potential rejection that follows. All that's a thing of the past, because they can make brand new hearts, livers, and kidneys and lungs just as God did the day you were born with stem cells from your own DNA. And I'm up there talking about in the richest country in the history of the world, in one of the richest cities in the richest country in the history of the world, we import 40% more food than we consume. We have a 40% waste rate from food we import into the city. We have 40 communities that are classified by the USDA as a food desert, and we can't solve that problem. But cars can drive themselves and make 1 billion calculations a second. Like, these problems shouldn't exist. And who is best to innovate entrepreneurial solutions to solve them? The business community. And the fact that these things still exist is, I think we've relegated it to the social sector that isn't poised for innovation and entrepreneurship and R&D, and they do the best they can with what they have. And what's missing is really this voice from the business community saying, we can come alongside you and solve those problems because it's what we do.
You think about the type of person that goes into social services and social work, they are there to meet the acute needs of the person that's hurting and in pain, right? I mean, that's what draws them to that work. It's probably less systematic. They're not thinking about it at a systematic level. Now, a lot of people will elevate to that over time because but a business owner, entrepreneur, that's just their innate wiring.
Yeah.
I see.
It would be akin to you thinking, and this is not a put down on CFOs, but your CFO is probably not going to cast the vision for the organization.
Right.
It's a different skill set.
That's right.
But does that diminish their skill set?
No, not at all.
Right?
It takes both.
It's an ecosystem,
That's
and
right.
we need all those voices and
all
skills.
the parts of the body, all the team members.
I think in the social sector, we're missing the innovation, the entrepreneurship side, the economic thinking perspective to actually solve these problems in a self-sustaining way. So we're not creating these engines that require significant philanthropic dollars year after year just to sustain serving people.
Yeah.
What happens when you remove the barrier with an economic engine that self-fulfills itself because it's monetized and people just navigate through it because they use it? You don't have to feed that beast anymore.
Hey, Darren, one of the things, and I'll let you land this and have the last comment, but what keeps coming back to me is something you said very early in this, though. No business leader, he or she would never or shouldn't, that means they're going to go out of business, ever make decisions or develop new products and services, solutions without knowing the customer. Due to lack of proximity and lack of desire, whatever the case may be, whatever gap that is, we don't have proximity enough to know the customer.
I don't know if you read the Forbes article. I think it was Forbes that came out with an article about the history of Jeff Bezos's annual reports. And they did a study of all of his reports and highlighted the words that he used the most. Do you know the word he used the most if you aggregate all of his annual reports over all the years?
No.
The single word he used the most is customer.
Front
If you're
center.
in business, you understand
Front
that,
center.
or you wouldn't be in business, right?
Right.
But it's easy for companies to forget because
Yeah.
they get in their walls.
Yeah,
Interesting that he kept it forefront.
yeah.
Darren, any closing comments?
I just thank you for the opportunity. I hope for those that had the opportunity to listen that somehow this sparks. We need each and every person that's a part of this great country to find their unique role to give back. And whether it's civic engagement or your own family or your family in your block or your business, or whether you're called to immerse yourself into one of the deepest societal challenges that we face today, we need you. And there's a host of things that are keeping us from doing that, and engagement's at an all-time low. So the closing challenge would just be to find your unique part with your unique gifts and make the difference where you can.
Darren, thank you for your grace, your humility, your life investment. And I just keep coming back to your humility from the transition to Bonton. I know that was not easy. Letting your kids go off to school and life is not much less war. But then for you to trust God and find the next path. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Thanks
you
for
all.
being here again.
My honor.
Great.
Thanks for joining us on Decision Points.